Hey guys, I'm Erin,
I'm Mo.
and this is Couch Astrology. Today we are going to be talking about the rising sign, also known as the Ascendant, and that is the third part that makes up what you may know as your big three.
Hmm.
I know a lot of people are familiar with that, and we talked about the sun and the moon in the last episode and how those planets kind of function together. So moving forward, we'll talk about the rest of the planets, but I wanted to stop here and talk about the rising sign a little bit because it does fill in that gap. I know a
Right.
lot of people, when they talk about astrology, go based off of sun, moon, and rising. So I figured why not have a conversation about it and get to know what the rising really means in your chart.
Hmm.
Um, so the rising sign is the sign that was rising off of the eastern horizon at the exact time that you were born. So based off of the time and the location of where you were. Um,
Yeah. And it changes every 2 hours. So throughout the day that is your birthday, you could have had so many possibilities of the rising sign. And that's why the rising sign is a really personal part of your chart. It's the most personal part of your chart.
yeah,
I mean, comparison, the sun changes every 28 days from signs.
yeah,
So the rising sign um, is very specific to that time and place that you're born.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the rising sign definitely is like the is changing the most frequently.
Hmm.
Um, and it's also kind of like representative of I like and I heard this, but the rising sign is kind of like when you say yes to life. So we had literally talked about childbirth,
Hmm.
and I think it was Chani again who
Hmm.
made this reference, but she was talking about her experience um, of like being in labor and how being in labor is such like a 12th house experience, and then it's really like the child's first experience with saying yes to what they want to motivate them in the world. Like, this is when I entered the world, and this is why, and this was the rising sign. I love that
Yeah.
concept. I think it so fits.
Yeah. And I think it was fun when you kind of started getting into that part of what the rising sign was because it starts to become a lot more, I think, um, otherworldly a little bit when you start talking about it than you might expect about the rising sign, which people might immediately go to like physical traits or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, but it is kind of like when your soul or your consciousness or whatever makes its first touch on the external world and then environment that it's in. Um,
Yeah. And I also like to think about, too, how I know, normal people in the world probably don't do this, but there are a lot of astrologers and stuff who will maybe like plan the signs of their children or
mm,
think that's a thing. Okay.
mm-hmm,
And the ascendant to me is almost like a child's like
say,
yeah, it's like the first time the child gets its own voice is like, no, actually this is the reason why I'm doing this. This is
mm-hmm,
my purpose. And nobody really has any there are so many, I mean, if we're using childbirth as an example, there are so many like factors that you can't account
control.
for or control when it comes to the experience of coming into the world,
Yeah, and it's kind of like your own autonomy at that point.
Yeah.
It's you're choosing for yourself, which, while you're in utero and through birth, I mean, you don't have many choices.
Yeah.
And that's the moment when you decide to come out. So, I mean, yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty.
So I guess the first thing that we can do is talk a little bit about like what the ascendant is. So
Hmm.
we're talking a lot about I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse a little bit.
Hmm.
So it's cool, the childbirth thing about the ascendant and it being kind of like the motivator for why we come into the world,
Hmm.
because the ascendant essentially it can be defined in a lot of ways, but one of them is like, what is my motivation in life?
Hmm.
And we kind of talked about that a little bit with like the sun
Hmm.
last week. And the sun can kind of be maybe like my soul's purpose,
Yeah.
and so I'm driven towards that. Like my heart is almost drawn. I think of the heart with the sun, right? Like
Hmm.
being ruled by Leo. And it's like
Hmm.
my heart can be drawn towards this direction. But the ascendant is really like the energy that guides
The
me
driving
there. Yeah,
force.
it is. And
Yeah.
that's, you'll hear that a lot. Like that is the ascendant is the driving force.
Hmm.
The
To get you
ascendant,
there.
yeah. And so because of that, it's also maybe the way that a lot of other people see us. Like they may not see that soul's purpose, right? And they
Hmm.
definitely are probably not seeing, at least first and foremost, like this is not the first thing they're going to see is my moon,
Hmm.
which is like strip away all of the ego of the sun. The moon's even nearer and dearer to me.
Hmm.
They're going to probably first see the ascendant, which is the energy that gets me there,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And what's natural and what's your, I guess, like the first instinct or
Yeah.
impulse
Yeah.
or reaction almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the rising sign is the first house. So we kind of briefly, I mean briefly, touched on what houses were in our last episode, but houses are the 12 sections of a chart that represent the different areas of life. So, for example, and I'll just throw out random ones, but maybe like if we're talking about the fourth house, and fourth house, lining up with the fourth sign in the zodiac, which is Cancer. We know that Cancer represents home and family, and you can oftentimes see like the themes parallel there. So here we have fourth house is going to be whatever planet I have in the fourth house is going to be, if I have one, maybe this energy is more so directed towards my family or things like that, and third house, maybe, I mean, we hear siblings oftentimes, but also maybe the ways that I communicate and how can I appear in those kind of dynamics, like in conversations and things like that with other people. So those are kind of like examples. And so then back to the ascendant is the first house.
And marks the first house cusp, I feel like. So the rising sign marks that exact moment. When you were born, that's your first house cusp. And so the first house is always where the planets rise, and the seventh is where they set. So that's why the first house is like where you're ascending, the ascendant, and the opposite would be the descendant, which would be opposite of your
rising sign.
So I feel like the other thing we should mention a little bit is just the physical appearance aspect of the rising sign, and how there's sometimes certain it can describe you in ways. I don't think it's always exactly by the book, but even if your energy is showing through the rising sign, there can be certain like physical indications maybe about a person.
I think so. It's not my favorite topic, like the physical attributes. I feel like when I find myself diving into it, I often find myself being like, there's just, because when things are not always true, when it comes to things like physical attributes and things like that, physical, like characteristics, it's harder for me to jump on board, but I do see it, right? Like we see with, even, I'll use my sister as an example, but we both have Leo risings, and we very similar, and she's a Virgo and I'm a Leo. So I'm a hard one to identify, because I always thought, okay, Leos are known to have like, wavy hair, like that lioness hair that's kind of messy and wavy and big, bold. It can show up in different ways. And it's one of those silly things, but you see it and it's often true. But for myself, I'm like, well, is it coming from my Leo sun, my Leo rising, or is it just because I was just born this way, But she also has that, and I see that there are certain themes. I can oftentimes look at whether it's a man or a woman, whoever it is, and be like, oh, they have very lion-esque features.
Even if it's not so like a specific pattern, it's a certain like energy maybe too. And I think, I mean, I kind of feel the same way, because I think there's some descriptors for Aries risings, and some super specific ones of like, having like a square forehead, which I'm not really sure if I do.
With what placement?
Aries risings.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Do you think I do? Square forehead? Do I?
It maybe. Yeah, a little bit. Like it's definitely like more angled.
Like angular.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that even beyond a specific physical trait, I think in a physical way,
we manifest those energies.
But and also like the physical, I guess, motion, of I feel like I'm always moving.
Well, that 100%. That 100%.
And that's still a physical thing.
Yeah.
It might not be how I look, but it's like part of my.
No, and that I love, because this is so true to life and human behavior, is that like my energy makes me appear a certain way, like however, this is how I present myself to the world. And we really naturally, again, characterize people into groups based off of the types of energies that they have, and so that is how we distinguish, and oftentimes can find groupings for what signs, maybe what even element, right, these people are like, oh, look at, or whether they're cardinal or fixed, it's like, oh, these people kind of behave in this way, and these people here, and the different
energy, or they have a sort of air
like
energy.
I'll more easily be able to be like, that's a fire sign. I was at a work meeting the other day, and one of our sales guys was clearly a fire sign, and it was written all over him, this just like chaotic, I'm not really going to like fall in line of procedure, but he gets the job done. He's
Mm-hmm.
actually our highest selling sales rep, or highest selling sales rep. And so he brings in the most money, but
Mm-hmm.
he has the least amount of structure to anything that he
Mm-hmm.
does. But even the way he showed up in the meeting, the way he was carrying himself was very just like loosey goosey, which I totally vibe with
Mm-hmm.
that energy because
Mm-hmm.
I find myself being that way often. But I was like, he's a fire sign.
Yeah,
And he
he's
was an
going after
Aries.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was like, this makes sense. It was very just like, nope, I'm just drilling through here, you know.
Yeah.
But that can show up. What his rising is, I have no clue.
Mm-hmm.
But that it essentially, yes, you're talking
Yeah, it's
about
sort
the
of
energy that
air
we
and sort of
present.
energy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, something to add there too of, and this is something that we've been talking about, that maybe I have a hard time with some of the definitions of certain placements and planets and signs, and just because it can start to meld into each other. And anyways, but with the rising sign, I don't think it's necessarily something you're thinking about or naturally. It's just is. It's just how I'm functioning. I'm not wondering why I feel like I'm running around when I'm about to go to bed and I'm brushing my
Yeah.
teeth so fast and washing. I don't know. And I mean, but that actually is true. It sounds so like stereotypical Aries rising, but I feel like I want to just get things done. I just don't want to be taking too long to do anything.
Yeah.
But there's no rhyme or reason when I'm thinking about that. I just do that. I'm
Yeah.
sure there's a reason, somewhere deeper down in there, but it's not like I'm putting much thought there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that's a good way to describe like the physical side of this,
yeah.
and I think it's easy to go down that road, especially with like a fire energy,
Yeah.
because that will be more prominent, I believe, at least in like the extreme way that it expresses
Mm-hmm.
itself
Yeah. More intensive.
physically. Yeah, but that's so true. And it is relevant. This our ascendant sign is maybe not something that we see. It's definitely not something that I'm really ever thinking about. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Until someone tells me about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't feel like I relate to it, which oftentimes happens because I'm an Aquarius moon, which is so different than my Leo rising. It
Yeah.
just, I mean, they're literally
It's
opposite.
not in my brain. You know what I
No,
mean? It's
in
not
my
how I see
brain,
myself.
yeah,
Yeah.
in my heart, in my brain, I'm like, I'm not thinking that maybe I'm showing up, or it's not always my intention to show up that way.
Exactly that.
And so it really requires a level of consciousness to see, like becoming conscious to how my ascendant pushes the energy forward in my chart.
Right.
Because especially having a Leo rising like me, is that I often don't mean to throw myself into the center, and I often don't want to be there,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And like you kind of mentioned, like the knee jerk reaction is the ascendant can really be the knee jerk reaction to how I handle
Mm-hmm.
situations. It just is. So I'll end up kind of realizing that I put myself in the middle of something literally, and then
You're
kind
like,
of
oh shit. Yeah.
revert and be like, that's not where I want to be.
Yeah. It's like there's a magnet underneath you, and that magnet's moving you rather than you moving it. It's
Yeah.
like the rising sign is guiding you.
Yeah.
More so where I feel like if you think about your sun sign or moon sign, of course that's also guiding you too in a way, but you're working with it. I think you're it's like more malleable, and your
Yeah.
rising sign is like, this is what we're doing. I
I
think.
think another thing too is that like the rising sign really, shows its face when we're in like uncharted territories.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that that's true, because when I'm unfamiliar or I've never navigated something, whatever specific thing it is, which will happen more often than not
Mm-hmm.
in life, I will more often encounter things that I've never done before than I will the things that I have, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so whether that's on a small scale or a big scale. And so my ascendant is almost that instinct, is like when I don't know what to do, I do this. And so maybe I act and then think about it later.
Mm-hmm.
And then so my kind of coming to myself at the end of the day and asking myself, is that maybe how I would have wanted to do that? And maybe it is, right? Like maybe I was able to channel all these things together,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe I did just knee jerk and my ascendant pushed
Showed
me.
me it.
And then maybe
Showed
I
it to me.
sat with
Yeah.
myself later and my Aquarius moon was like, that wasn't really logical. Like that didn't, the way that you did that maybe didn't make sense or didn't
I don't
honor.
feel good about that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't feel good about that. And so then my moon sign will kind of redirect me. So I see that in more uncharted territories. But then the flip side is that I think the more that we get to know situations, and when I say get to know situations, get to know ourselves in situations, or the closer friends that we have, like you probably see less of my ascendant sign ruling me than people who are
Totally,
just meeting
totally.
me, like you, and the same thing with you, right? Like I see more of your sun and moon when we interact and communicate because we've been friends for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
However, people that meet you right off the bat, I may not relate to their interpretation of you
Totally.
because
Yeah.
we have learned how to communicate on a deeper level.
Yeah. It's, well, and it's not, it doesn't feel,
Like I'm blindly being
yeah, or
moved.
like nerve wracking. I don't know what the right word is there, but um, it's a different kind of natural, because I know we're talking about the rising being
Yeah.
natural, and that's your, but yeah, the uncharted territories thing. But it's, um, I can I can sit in myself more
Yeah.
when you're comfortable, and access those other parts of the sun and the
Yeah.
moon and those placements, and um, but and it's also being aware that you know me,
Yeah.
and I think when you're with new people, you have the awareness that they don't know you yet. So there's an idea of what their perception is, and I think it's just, I don't know, that rising sign will kind of like take over.
Yeah. Well, and really, because my, maybe, how should I put this? My lack of, and not even lack, but the fact that I see your ascendant sign less frequently is not, has nothing to do with me,
Mm,
right? It has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with your comfort level, or
mm,
and maybe not even comfort level, but your familiarity,
mm-hmm.
you know? And so naturally you are falling into maybe this sense of the moon. Like I would say we're on moon level. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But however, there's layers to the
Yeah.
onion, you
Some people
know?
only get sun level, some people only get
Yeah.
rising level.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And if
yeah,
you
yeah.
were to get into a space with me, even after all these
I see you
years,
on rising level though,
but same,
and
right?
it's different.
Yes, and that's what I was going to say is like we can still, as soon as maybe my guard comes back up, and I'll use that as an example in this situation because I would assume maybe that's when you see my rising sign, but also when you see me around other people that
That's
I'm
the where
less
I'm.
comfortable with.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when I see you in new settings where I'm with you with new people, I see a different side, and it's not a bad or good. It's just because that part is also very much still you, but
yeah,
it's because you are not thinking that hard about it.
yeah.
You're not thinking about it at all. But it's, and I'm like, who is that? No, just kidding. But yeah,
No, but it's so true. And I think especially having like a Leo rising, I'm also a Leo sun. So I
yeah.
think, and same with you, you have an Aries rising and you have an Aries moon. So
Mm.
both of these parts, both of our risings happen to be already ingrained into that
Yeah,
like big three dynamic, but it looks so different for
it looks
everybody.
different, but it looks different. Your Leo rising is acting different than like what your Leo sun might be like on a
100%.
comfortable level, and it might not make sense saying that out loud, but because it's both Leo energy, but
Yeah.
it's, I mean, you're also considering like the house placement too with the
Yeah.
sun sign and all that, but it's you got to think about more about what the planet's doing too.
Yeah.
You know.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so essentially the rising sign becomes kind of this filter, and maybe for lack of a better word, I'll say filter, you know, but it really is that thing that's pushing these things forward. So I have to find ways
Mm-hmm.
to honor my sun and my moon so that when my rising is doing the pushing, I don't feel like I'm not being true to myself, because that
Mm-hmm.
can happen. That's, you
Yeah.
know, and it is. I think it's human nature to sometimes just be and then sit and realize like, ugh, like I've had many days, especially as a Leo rising, sitting back and being like, oh my God, I did not like the way I showed up today. You know, like,
And
oh my God, why did I throw myself into that? Why did I feel like I had to make it about me or whatever it is? And those are obviously more of the negative interpretations, but like I want to honor that, like even my Leo sun
yeah.
of being like, what is my soul's purpose? Like, what does it mean to be driven by Leo energy? And how can I use Leo energy to push that
Yeah.
forward, you know,
Yeah.
without getting so egocentric or feeling like I want to be in the center all the time when I don't,
Mm-hmm.
you know, my
When it actually
Aquarius
doesn't
moon.
even feel
Yeah.
that's what you want, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and so getting to know all three of those parts and kind of figuring out how they can function together and push it forward. And I know we had also mentioned, and I like this idea, like the, and bringing this up is we often think that it, I don't know, we often think the moon comes last, and a lot of the times the sun comes last. Like I do like that, to explore that idea. It's different for everybody, but like we were using my younger brother as an example,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll use him again, but he's Libra sun, Aries rising, Aquarius moon.
Mm-hmm.
And I went in the order of breaking down these placements for him
In the
specifically.
situation,
Yeah.
how they start to function.
Yeah, of going ascendant, moon, sun. Okay, so I'll elaborate. But he's an Aries rising, and he's very like pressure to be perfect. Like I need to be doing this thing extremely well. Like that Aries kind of sense of self and being the best and being really impulsive in my emotions towards it, you know? And so that really drives him, and he can be really hard on himself. And however, he is extremely logical. And so he will have a hard time with that Aries rising. And it's like, this is just how it has to be. Act, act, act. And then we'll revert into, you know, his alone time. He'll go into his alone time and go into that Aquarius moon and say, well, maybe it doesn't have to be so quick, and maybe it doesn't have to be perfect, and maybe I don't have to be so hard on myself, but there has to be, he's got to break it down structurally, and it has to make sense. Rationalize it
from the moment.
Yes, which is all Aquarius. And then I see that sun in Libra, which is like the soul's purpose, you know, of wanting to be in harmony. You know, when we think of Libra, we think of harmony, and we often think of other people, which is absolutely relevant, but like harmony of self too, you know. And so sometimes like all of these things work together so that I can really learn how to tap in to the purpose of my sun, you know.
And I think you touched on a good point too previously with both of us, of how your Leo rising might do something different than your Leo sun, which is that even though they're in the same sign, these energies doesn't necessarily, you could have the same sign in your big three, and it doesn't mean it's going to be everybody's like getting along, the sun, moon, and rising are all doing what you want to do. I think being a, you know, Aries rising, Libra sun too, just like your brother, but I have an Aries moon, and you would think, okay, well, the Aries rising, the Aries moon, they're going to be happy with each other. But I find that my Aries rising gets impatient with my own feelings. And so they're going to be at odds with each other too, because my Aries moon is feeling things intensely, and it does need a little bit of time, not so much time, but it does need a little bit of time to feel those emotions. And my Aries rising is like, all right, let's move on, you know? So it's not always going to acknowledge, I guess, what's there.
Well, and it reminds me,
naturally.
And it reminds me of like going back to rulership, which we talked about in our last episode too, because, and I'll use Leo as an example, but because Leo's ruled by the sun. So Leo is ruled by the sun. So Leo's going to function really well in the sun. Those themes, they complement each other. Well, they don't even complement each other. They are the same, you know, they have the same purpose. And so, but if you have a Leo sun, Leo moon, well, it doesn't work that way. You know, Leo is not at home in the sun. You know, it's not. Cancer is. And we know Cancer and Leo, like they may get along, but they aren't the same. You know, they aren't. If we're looking at the raw energies of both signs, like they are very different, and they're driven by very different things. And Cancer is driven by exactly what the moon is driven by, you know, which is that sense of self, that sense of motherhood, no matter who you are, you know what I mean? But that sense of nurturing and intuition and everything that like the gut rules and that our emotions would represent, you know, our emotional experiences would represent, and that kind of that feeling of comfort and home and all of those themes. Well, Leo can't advocate for that. Like Leo. So just because I have my sun and moon in the same sign doesn't mean that, like you said, that they are going to
be in perfect balance and harmony.
Exactly. And, like each sign and each planet is kind of trying to find its own. And some planets have an easier time, or some signs have an easier time to do that, and some signs have a harder time doing that.
But they're all learning to compromise and get along and figure out what, you know, and you're trying to figure out how you want to show up at it and what's your values and what feels good to you. And
and those are just the things. And that's why I love talking about the ascendant, because it is, like we said, it is the sign that is changing the most frequently. And so it is the most individualized part of our chart. And that's going to be the thing that pushes everything else forward.
So going into the chart ruler, your chart ruler, you find it by looking at your rising sign. So for me, for example, my rising sign is Aries, and you go to the planet that rules that sign. So Aries is ruled by Mars. So I'll go to that placement in my chart, or my Mars is, and my chart ruler will be that placement. So it's
like the entire placement.
So it's, my chart ruler is Mars and Sagittarius in the 8th house. And this is a strong point in your chart because the rising works with this, with your chart ruler. It is that driving force, and the chart ruler is kind of where the energy gets manifested into, almost, or where it kind of starts to flow into. So it can come to the forefront a little bit as well, with maybe, the sun and the moon. It can be a bigger piece of the puzzle or of the chart, in that way, I guess.
Yeah, I love to look at the chart ruler because I know. Okay, so I'm a Leo rising, so we know Leo is ruled by the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So I would look to my sun placement. So I went Leo, Leo's ruled by the sun. Go to my sun placement. Well, my sun placement is in
Is
Leo.
also Leo.
Can't escape it. So yeah, my sun placement's in Leo, but it's in the 12th house. So that's always like an interesting take for me because we talked about like how maybe it feels to be a Leo rising and how that energy may manifest. And so then the next thing I would look at is my chart ruler. Like, this is the real pusher,
Mm-hmm.
like this is going to be like a really dominating force. And
Mm-hmm.
not only is it Leo, which is obviously very prevalent in my chart, but being in the 12th house does give some of those feelings of like, you know, I want to be I want to be in the center, right? But I want it to naturally be in the center. I
Mm-hmm.
don't
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to manufacture being in the center. I don't want to feel like other people don't want me in the center. And
Mm-hmm.
so I want to feel like I think the sense of empowerment that I
Mm-hmm.
get is not when someone throws me in a room and is like, look, you can lead this room full of people and
Yeah.
let them listen to you. I don't want that, right? I
Mm-hmm.
want to be around like a community or in
Mm-hmm.
an environment where I feel like I can do something, I don't know, in a way that feels organic,
Yeah, and I
you know?
think also another part to that sun in the 12th house too is feeling like, or at least for you, is um I don't know how to put this with the 12th house, but that's sort of like, I guess, being maybe misunderstood a little bit. And I
Mm,
think maybe as a Leo too, that might come, but just, yeah, feeling like people aren't always getting you at first glance,
100%.
sort of. And
100%.
that is also, not only is that something that you feel in general just because it's your sun, but that being in your chart ruler, it's like, well, that might be a spot there of like this,
Yeah, and that's like my chart ruler being my sun,
mm-hmm,
is like that's my is really a big part of
mm-hmm,
me. Like that is my identity. I feel like I am so like my soul is so connected to kind of this. I want people to see me for who I am.
yeah,
I want people to see me for who I am. And that's like, let's stray away from like the stereotype of a Leo that can also be very fitting,
mm-hmm,
right? Of like this, you know, needing to be in the center, wanting to be in the center, do I want to be directly in the center, whatever, all of that stuff. But looking at the Leo of wanting to feel like they express themselves
mm-hmm,
in a way that is,
authentic,
yeah, like in a way that people can grasp and
mm,
understand, like to express is to also like, I don't know, like for people to be able to like take that in, do you know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like when I don't know, I think of like art, and we
I was thinking
create,
that too, like
yeah,
to connect and to
yeah, yes,
um be able to, you know, touch other people and see what that's a kind of like the life force, like it. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an intangible thing to kind of
yeah,
describe, but yeah,
yeah,
it's,
it's hard to put words to, but I also think it's very simple and straightforward,
yeah.
and so, but that's so true, and I think that is a constant theme. But also we know of like 12th house being kind of like background work, where it's like maybe you're next to someone who's doing the same things as you, and there's a lot of recognition here, but you're kind of doing the behind the scenes stuff, which is very true in my life. But being a Leo, you're like, I did it too,
Yeah. Yeah.
but then you don't say it, and
Yeah.
so then there's just I think the special part of that, and something that I really had to experience over time or allow myself to appreciate over time, is that like the people in my life who really do see me for who I am,
Mhm.
and even though they're fewer and further in between, like
Mhm.
the Leo wants it to be kind of a lot, or at least I think I thought that about myself for a long
Mhm.
time, and that could have been that rising, that
Mhm.
drive where it's like, you all right, this is what, like, you want to be appreciated by the masses.
Mhm.
And what I've learned over time is that it's like, no, the people that do appreciate, like, that is where I feel most loved, is where
Mm-hmm.
people can like recognize me for like who I am and exactly what I offer, and I know that they see me for me.
And it doesn't have to be everybody.
And it doesn't have to be
And that's
everybody.
kind of where the Aquarius moon comes into, where it's like,
Yeah.
hello, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Leo and Aquarius both have like paralleling themes
Mm-hmm.
of like wanting to be that like individualistic
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, all of those things. They want to be different and in
Mm-hmm.
different ways, you know, but that
Totally.
kind of, I want to be seen for whatever it is. And so, yeah, those, but they do it very differently,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so then there's
Mm-hmm.
also a conflict there between those placements, but they really work well together. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I do feel grateful to have the kind of balance,
Mm-hmm.
which has just come through lots of lessons, which everybody has, regardless of the placement, you know.
Yeah.
But then for yours, I always say, and it's again hard to put words to, but when I think of chart ruler and then I think of yours, I'm like, yes, you know, like,
And it's funny when you say that too, because I mean, I can kind of see what you're like thinking, but then I'm also like, really? You know what I mean? I don't know.
I know, and I maybe it's just because when I fell into astrology, and I think I mentioned this in our last episode, but I was deeply in my camp. I just went back for a second.
She was there.
I was like deeply lost in the Cancerian energy in my chart.
Mm,
Like my Venus and Mars in Cancer, and they're both in the 12th house. And talk about stereotypical themes of like self destruction and isolation, and then the emotions of Cancer. I was drowning. And that's when I got into astrology. And so I was so deeply ingrained in those parts of my chart. But you were also in my life
mm-hmm,
and had been, but it was our first time getting into astrology
mm-hmm,
together. And I was there. So I was living in that part of my chart at
mm-hmm,
the time. And your placements contrasting mine, Venus and Mars being in Sagittarius, and they're both
mm-hmm,
in the eighth house.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it just was so different,
Yeah,
even though we both, the eighth and the 12th, complement each other in that
yeah,
way. But you weren't lost in anything. Like you, not maybe on the level that I was, but that sense of freedom that Sagittarius has in those placements.
yeah, totally. That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, and I wanted that, and I just remember
Uh,
thinking like, please, you know. And then
yeah,
we
yeah,
started
yeah.
going into the chart ruler, and I'm like, oh, this makes sense. It's such an integral part of who you are. I think is the type of freedom that I think a Sagittarius holds, and I use freedom in different ways for different
Yeah.
signs, but Sagittarius is very specific, I think,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and it really is just this sense of like, um, I don't want to, it's not detachment, you know, but
I was actually just getting there. Like
yeah,
we're on the same wavelength right now, but yeah, sort of like a it's kind of, this is something that I lean on so hard in my life and for my mental health. Literally, this thing I come back to, and it's kind of like a nihilistic way of like, I don't know, maybe no, actually no, this is definitely it. The like we're all gonna die. Like who cares? It's not
yeah.
that big of a deal. I think that brings me a lot of peace. Like
Well, but think of Sagittarius being like the ruled by Jupiter, and it's Jupiter is all about expansion and optimism, and Sagittarius really is that way. Like it's like, well, let's just do it and have fun doing it.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
that sort of like when I, in my Libra mode and especially in that Aries mode, not that it's negative, but just when it's kind of, I'm in my brain a lot and I'm thinking things through a lot and I'm having a lot of feelings, and it's that Sag part that kind of comes in, and it's like, who cares? And it's not in a mean way to myself. It's like, let it go
let it
for
be light.
yourself.
Let it
Like
be
let it
light.
be,
Yeah,
you don't worry about it. And it's like, okay, there's not much else there to it. I'm just like, it's
yeah,
like a shrug your shoulders type of
yeah,
thing. It's be at ease, be relaxed. And I
yeah.
think not avoidant, but I do think, well, if we're gonna go there, it being in Venus, I
Mm.
think that at that time too, in the eighth house, having those sort of cycles and transformations, I think that that was a huge thing I learned about myself and relationships, and even close, like, super close friendships, of just that sort of, um
Avoidancy.
yeah, maybe it was like avoidance, but it's kind of like this, the game of like a chase, and like, and then getting bored and then on to the next thing, but then
So Sagittarius, but Sagittarius also don't really, because of those positive traits that they have. A lot of times, the way Sagittarius will express themselves when it comes to conflict is that like we're we're not going to go
yeah, I'm
there.
just
We're not going
over
to get
it.
involved in
Yeah, I'm
that.
just over it. And
Yeah.
I think when it was in, certain negative points in my past and like negative places in certain relationships and stuff, like it was in that eighth house place. It's like when I finally got on the other side of that, whatever heartbreak or sadness or whatever it was like and I think a lot of people feel like this with heartbreak, but still, it did feel like, oh my God, I'm a new person. Like I feel like I had transformed out of that dark
when you get on the other side
past.
of it.
Yeah, when you get on the other side, it's like, oh my God, it's like these like birthing pains, and it's kind of something that I remind myself now going forward of these cycles, that like every time there's kind of I don't know, a lower point, like I have that sort of experience maybe now where I know, um, you learn and you come out of it stronger, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and Sagittarius being a fire sign, but also the type of fire sign that it is like a lot of the times Sagittarius, when like on the way to the other side of maybe like an experience, is like they're all about the stage character anyways. Like we are going to suit up and show up in whatever way that we feel necessary for the day. But then there is this like surge of energy that comes when like the actual other side is
it
reached.
Feels, I mean, I'm being dramatic, but it feels almost like a manic thing. Like it's like I'm so like, it's the intensity of like, like being so happy and being so optimistic and being, like,
which I think with Sagittarius too can also allow them, like open up this door for them to almost even like enter into the same experience sometimes if they're not completely conscious, because that can be so blinding where it's like, oh, everything's amazing again and I'm here and we got nothing to worry about anymore, and then months later you're like, shit, how did I?
And that's that pattern with the eighth house too in my Venus, where it's like, oh, wait, I did this 2 years ago. And I'm back in it again. It's
but think about it, regardless of your Venus, even thinking about your Mars, which is your chart ruler too, because the Mars is that driving energy. Like especially I'm sure having them conjunct, which is like they're working together because they're in the exact same sign and house. Like that Mars is driving all of those things that's happening, and it's your chart ruler. So it's like we're pushing all of this forward, and your Venus is just almost mimicking it.
Yeah, definitely.
And so it is interesting. But also anything that we say about signs, like talking about Sagittarius and being her chart ruler, like when with this episode being about the ascendant, we can use what we describe, the signs in general, and apply it to what's happening in the placement, And so taking like what we're talking about with Sagittarius, if you had a Sagittarius rising, and asking yourself, how can this apply? How or would this relate to me if I had a Sagittarius rising? How would that work as being my motivator? Do I see myself doing this sometimes? Am I overly optimistic? Am I just, and it doesn't have to be overly, right? I think we're getting stuck in, and maybe I'm getting stuck in the language of extremes, which is really big thing in astrology. But
it's real. But
the ascendant is not a negative thing. The ascendant is literally just the motivator.
However, it's neutral.
It's everything is neutral. Everything is neither good nor bad, and I will continue to re-emphasize that. We use a lot of negatives when we talk because it helps us understand the positives too. And it's just the language that we use, but like hopefully filter for yourself, and we'll try to do our best to balance it out. But like taking when we talk about different signs and what they're doing in different placements, it's like, okay, well, am I overly optimistic here, or am I, this, I don't know, can I be a stage character sometimes when I go out in public? That's a huge thing for fire signs,
and being
in general.
Jovial and being kind of like, I feel like Sag risings too have that sort of like, I mean, this might just be keeping it super simple, but I know a few Sag risings and I feel like all of them are hilarious. You know what I mean?
Here's the thing. People love Sagittarius risings.
Yeah.
I do too. But because Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter is the planet of luck, expansion. I talked about those things. Jupiter is that girl. Jupiter's the best. Sorry.
Yeah.
Period.
No, and they even say, I mean, the stars. I've heard about Sag risings that it's kind of like having a little luck with you everywhere you go with the Jupiter right there.
But it is. And I think about Spencer, my husband. He's a Sagittarius rising. And dude, people love him though. You know what I mean? Like seriously, but
he's such a likable person.
Yes, he is a very likable person. Like he is very good at presenting himself in groups and things like that. And so is Elle, my friend Elle. She is. I'm just throwing people's names out there. But okay, here's the thing. I don't care. but she's a Pisces.
Yeah.
And I always would say this about our friendship is that I'm a Leo. So dude, and I'm a Leo rising, Leo sun, Leo. What you see is what you get.
Yeah.
And that just is true. And not completely, but energy wise, 100%.
Yeah.
And so people know that I can come off like a little more brash because I'm just,
you're fiery. And
I'm fiery. Yeah. She's a Pisces. She's like softer natured and she's a Sag rising. So literally people just love that girl. And we would go out together. I think people would really question like, why are you so close with Erin? Like she says like what she thinks, you know? And
little do they
know, but like in close quarters, we're talking the same language. She's an Aquarius moon, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so we both are Aquarius moons, but we're talking the same. And we would crack up because I think Sag risings know it too. They're like, oh yeah.
It's like a charm. It's like people wrap it on their finger.
It really is like a superpower.
Yeah.
And there is nothing wrong with that. Like this is, if you can harness your energy and like get the masses to just absolutely, because that doesn't mean you're fooling anybody.
And the best thing about the Sag energy doing that too, in like a rising sign specifically, is just like they actually don't even really care that much. You know, people are going to be gravitating towards you, and they aren't even really thinking
it depends. It depends on your placement.
Okay,
it depends
on your
placement.
I feel like it's different than maybe like how I would perceive at least like a Leo rising or Aries rising, who kind of feels good about that. I would say,
but like say a Leo sun with the Sag rising would feel good about that.
Yeah.
Yes, but 100%. There are that's where it's going to depend on the rest of your placements. But like I don't think like Elle, for example, I don't think she cared about that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's a Pisces. She didn't care what they thought, but it was funny. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so this is like everybody's rising sign it really is so indicative to like the person that you pick up initially or when you're not out in the world with them as frequently. And I just think it's such a cool thing, you know, and we were having a conversation before this about how we get so morphed in our own perceptions of maybe what it means to be driven by that, because your moon is in Aries and my sun is in Leo.
Whole, you know, sister signs and our big three.
Yeah.
And
it's just
energy.
A lot of the energy meshes together. And so it requires like conscious thought and conversation.
Yeah, for us like you have to know yourself. We're like sitting here like dissecting.
Like what Leo part is coming from the sun and what part is coming from the ascendant. But it's a good, like if you have placements, I have friends that have, you know, all three, you know, sun, moon, rising in the same sign, and that will happen.
They're not acting the same, right?
No, they're not acting the same. But the point is like
no, but I mean like the sun, moon, and rising in those same signs, like they're not functioning at all.
No, yeah, and we had talked about that, and that's like, but it's to sit down and ask yourself the question is like what is coming from where, and that's been the biggest thing for me with astrology is I think asking myself those questions. And literally the only way that I've found it possible is just to study people. You know, I just gather charts from everything that I watch, whether it's reality TV or people in the world, celebrities, my friends. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of charts, and just looking at placements. And then all of a sudden I start to have these groupings of like, oh, okay, this comes from here, you know,
and yourself too, when you start to see, because I mean, there's a lot. I mean, we have I'm getting carried away from myself. This is kind of more into houses, but we all have all of the signs energy somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you can look into your own chart and see, well, in this place, I kind of exhibit this in this way in this planet. And it can still kind of give you an idea of what that energy is looking like, you know, and that's kind of, I think, a big part, I said this last time, but of why it's really interesting and important to talk about what the planets are, what the placement is, so that when you're putting the sign, that energy in there, you know, you can sort of like put two and two together of what that will look like.
Yeah. And that's why I like going into this in these episodes, I wanted to break down like what do these planets mean? You know what I mean? And I didn't maybe initially jump into learning that way. But I found it so helpful to just really sit down and separate everything from each other and just think about, what is this? What does it mean to be a rising sun? You know, what does it mean to be the sun? What does it mean to be the moon? Outside of everything else, what do these things offer? What do they do? What experiences do they, you know, represent or create. And then same thing with the signs. Like, what is the raw energy of this sign? Yes, I know what it means to be a Leo with an Aquarius moon because I am that. But what is just the raw energy of a Leo? If I had nothing else, what would be Leo? You know? And when I say if I had nothing else, I mean, if I had no other placements, like my chart was blank, which isn't possible, but if I was just a Leo sun, what would that mean?
Yeah.
You know? And then if I was just an Aquarius moon, what would that mean? And so, but then being able to put those things together, you know? And I think you get so much from that. But yeah, like you are your first teacher. I would have not really been able to, I wouldn't have had a starting point if it weren't for myself.
Yeah.
You know, it gives me a reference point. And it's why I appreciate having different signs in my chart, but that are in planets. But even if you don't, you have them in your houses, right? Like what sign falls into your houses. And that, you know, that's for further down the road. But we are all everything.
But
it's
that's something
just
to consider before you hate a sign, because it's
you're in there somewhere. Yeah, I had a negative. I was that girl, which shame.
Me too.
But
sometimes, but
no. But shame.
Yeah, totally.
You know,
100%.
Because that just, I have learned that if you want to have someone like never respect you or never respect talking astrology in general, like those Taurus out there, they don't like me, you know what I mean? But I love Taurus today. But it's just, that was my first, I think, experience in studying astrology, and because my Saturn's in Taurus, so let's just be real, I was experiencing my own roadblock of being able to understand a part of myself, and I projected it on other people. And I was like, oh, you're a Taurus. So anyways, it's just, there's no good or bad, you know, everything just is. And we have these parts in ourselves. And usually when I'm judging a sign or a placement, it's because I'm struggling to understand that part of myself. Period.
So true.
So I don't know if you wanted to talk about, like, before we wrap it up, about the experience of like what we come into in the Ascendant. Did you want to go into that at all?
Well, like the touching on the delivery stuff.
Well, we could touch on delivery stuff. Yeah, I think all tying in together is like what circumstances, like the circumstances of our life. Or what did you want to talk about?
I was thinking about, we talked to her mom earlier, but
that's what. Yeah, I was thinking about both. Yeah.
Oh well, that's what led into it. Okay, so yeah, I feel like that was a point that was getting us there, was that the rising sign is also kind of part of the circumstances you come into when you're born, and in childbirth, and those first few moments. We kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier, but you're right. It's like the identity you're taking on, based on that environment, based on those external circumstances. It's something you carry with you, I think. When you think about like your rising sign, and when you start to understand what that means, it's something that like is kind of the story you tell to yourself. And interestingly enough, I feel like earlier when we were talking about how the rising sign comes off a certain way, and like I'm like, oh, I don't really see that often anymore because we're really close. I feel like I've heard people talk about in the past the rising signs, the mask, and I didn't really like that, because I feel like it's not
intentional.
Yeah, it's not intentional.
A mask
it feels
feels
like
intentional.
It feels like you're just, this is, just there. But I feel like I almost kind of get it now if I interpret it differently. It's kind of like the story we have of ourselves, or we tell ourselves in a way.
I like that.
And so, I think one of the things that were really interesting when we started talking about, the circumstances you come into, when we started talking to your mom about kind of your siblings and their rising signs, and they were just I'll let you take that from there.
Well, no, I was just going to say, like, we obviously had touched on at the very beginning, we jumped straight into that idea of childbirth, which I love that. I think it's so fun. Like that, like, this is when we said yes to life. Like, this is maybe potentially my first act of rebellion, but it doesn't have to be rebellion. Like, maybe no one's fighting against that, but it is this first statement of like autonomy and things like that, which is beautiful. But also what she mentioned, like the circumstances that we come into at birth. And so a lot to do with, we were like, let's get my mom on the phone, and just, my mom has 6 kids. So let's just break down some of the experiences that she's had. And this is just, these are fun parts of astrology. I feel like, to just, sometimes it's just fun to like kind of pick around and see like, does it fit,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the times it will,
Oh my
which is
gosh.
so cool.
We were like, because at first we're kind of asking her and she's a little bit like, just talking about
She's
nurses
like,
and
my
talking about
deliveries were all pretty
whatever.
easy, keeping it really general. And then she's like, well,
Then we're like digging and digging, and then suddenly she says something, and we're like,
yeah. So once the pressure maybe came off of her trying to jog her memory about each individual, 6 births, that she's like, okay, now I'm starting to remember some details. And the first one she gave was talking about my older brother, who's a Scorpio rising. He's the only water rising in the family, and was the only child that she got into. Her midwife had her get into like a little pool of water,
mm-hmm,
and she didn't give birth in the water, but she was supposed to help induce her. And
mm-hmm.
so she sat in the water. She hated it.
Was
She
uncomfortable.
was uncomfortable. She got out. She was sick.
Mm-hmm.
My brother was born. He
She
was
was in pain.
sick.
Yeah.
She was in pain. So both of them were sick. She was in water. Anyways, it was just fun. He's a
Yeah.
Scorpio rising. And so
Yeah.
we have all of these themes that kind of parallel with Pluto,
Mm-hmm.
which is representative of, can be sickness,
Mm-hmm.
can be, we talk about like death and rebirth
Mm-hmm.
and stuff, which doesn't have to be physical death, but this kind of just more dark experience. We had him in water,
Mm-hmm.
where he is the only water sign rising. So it was just like, oh, that's
Oh well,
interesting.
I guess Stone's a water sign rising.
Oh, he is.
Yeah.
He is. Okay.
But
You're right.
still, it's
Yeah.
a specific Scorpio rising type of
Yes.
vibe. The
It
Cancer rising one is even.
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about this too, like with my older brother being a Scorpio rising, is that obviously childbirth can be painful.
Yeah.
So when we think of themes of pain and did it, but she was literally sick. Like she
Yeah,
was sick,
yeah.
and he was sick.
And she specifically talks about being uncomfortable because she's in the water.
Yes.
Which is, what's crazy is I actually read something about Scorpio recently about how it's a water sign, but scorpions aren't naturally in the water anyways. And I don't know. I don't have much else to say about that. But
Okay, interesting. No,
just
that's
on the
interesting just for
topic.
that example.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about scorpions, so that's
Yeah.
interesting. Or Scorpios. Just kidding. But then I was the second born, and I'm a Leo rising,
Mhm.
but I was the first daughter.
Mhm.
My mom said it was the first and only time, I think she said the only time, that she pulled out the mirror, that the midwife wanted her to have a mirror in her first birth with my older brother, and she was not ready to see all that. And so she said with me was the first time that she pulled
Which
out a
is
mirror.
interesting in a contrast with the Scorpio rising not really wanting to
Yeah.
look, and then her being the Leo rising.
Well, because she was offered it.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing too, is that she only had a midwife with me and my older brother, because we lived in Orlando at the time, and that's just how they did it. And so I'm assuming the reason she wasn't probably even offered a mirror in her births following was because she was in Georgia at that point, and they were in the hospital and whatever. But yeah, with Jacob being a Scorpio rising, my older brother, and she denied it. Scorpio, not really wanting to go there. Scorpio is more so like, I mean, how would you describe the energy?
Like, it's not like I don't want to stand out. It's just like there's things that are more
personal almost.
I want to keep this a little bit more closer to me. This is not for the world. This is not, and
or the Scorpio just not wanting to see themselves in the that's
fair.
But these all being rising signs. So then me being a Leo rising, she's like, we're pulling out the mirror. And it's the only time she uses it, so that's comical. And then she literally said she like leaned over and helped pull
out of her, which is, just so fucking cool. I'm sorry, but that is
okay.
So cool.
I thought the same thing.
No,
yes.
It's so cool that's the experience that was there. But it's like, I don't know. I don't think there was any sort of like more special attention, but it's like that immediate, like you had contact immediately with your mom's hands, like before you're even touching the world.
Yeah. So maybe she actually, I was laughing thinking maybe I didn't get my moment of autonomy. She's like, you're coming at me.
She's like, nah, that's mine. Yeah, which is interesting when we talk about in contrast to your younger brother, because it was the opposite experience.
With which one?
Sean.
Yeah. So then Sean, and I won't go down every single example, but it's just fun to do. Is like, then we have Sean being an Aquarius rising, and what did she say? Like there was just,
a mix up.
Oh yeah. So first of all, there was a whole mix up. They gave her the wrong baby after she gave birth.
And he was also like, they didn't bring him back for hours. So he,
yes.
You were immediately, as a Leo rising, it's like you had that immediate, like,
contact,
you're in the mirror,
and
you're seeing, you're kind of like there immediately. And then there's the Aquarius rising where it's like they literally took him.
Yeah. And so
And
this like
then,
sense of detachment from birth where it's like, okay, I am being separated. She said she got to hold him for a minute or two, and then they took him away and he was gone for hours, to the
yeah,
point where she said she felt like, she's like, this is embarrassing. The
yeah,
kids are waiting to meet their brother, and
yeah,
like they're not bringing him back. And so, but she also had a lot of complications. Like she almost went into cardiac arrest when they started. But
yeah,
so all of those things. But I think the most important thing there with the Aquarius rising is that sense of
yeah, the
separation.
space a little bit,
Yeah.
and bringing the other child almost like not really being seen,
Like one
like,
of many, you know what I
yeah, one
mean?
of
One of
many.
many is just grab a baby and give it to her, you know what
Yeah,
I mean? And it's interesting to see kind of the ways that he shows up in the world, as he does have such this air of, now he's also a chart full of air essentially,
mm-hmm,
but he has, you know, no pun intended, but this air about him
mm-hmm,
that is detached. You know, that is his, the way he pushes his chart forward and his
mm-hmm,
energy forward is very much so cool, calm, and collected.
mm-hmm,
I'm not attached to
mm-hmm.
anything. You're doing too
In
much.
contrast to you,
In
it's
contrast
so
to me, which
different.
is the
Yeah,
opposite in
yeah,
our, yes, we approach the world in two very, very different ways. And it's not to say that he is a detached person. Like he is
yeah,
an extremely sentimental, meaningful person. He has an amazing relationship with my mom, who he wasn't able to really bond with at birth, like one of the most special
mm-hmm.
relationships. However, it shows kind of how that
It's
ascendant,
that natural thing that we
yeah,
talked about where it's like it happens. And I
yeah,
think that's something that we were talking about earlier too, where it was like, well, why when you're looking at what the sun and this means or the rising means, it's like when if you're reading a definition about the rising sign, okay, like Aries rising, they move this way. Okay, this is how you're moving. This is how you're
mm.
going about
He is
things. That's the
literally
scripture.
floating. Like I just
Yeah.
feel like he's just moving along, where I'm like, all right, come on, come on. And he's like, dude, shut up. Like, and he is just so, I mean, if I interrupt him in a conversation, he's like, you interrupted me. We're done talking. And I'm like, please talk to me, you know? And so we are pushed by two different things, but it's fun to look at. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because no one way is good and no one way is bad. It's just helps us get to know ourselves and helps us get to know each
Mm-hmm.
other. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just, the birth stories are just fun to look
There's
at.
a lot more there, the rising sign. I mean, as there is every time we talk
Yeah.
about something, but there's, I think, a lot more there than people might immediately think when they think rising being your first impression or your just your perception. You know, it's, yeah. I mean, it is that driving force of your chart and of
Yeah.
you, and
It is, it helps, I think, us develop this greater sense of self-awareness to our purpose. You
mm-hmm,
know, it's
mm-hmm.
because I can't just choose to ignore something about myself. I mean, I can, but I will not be
Yeah, how's that
successful,
gonna go?
you
Yeah.
know? And so it is important to look at it and see, like, how am I showing up in the world, and how can I use this in my power? How can I use this to push my soul's purpose forward
Mm-hmm,
and get to know myself better and be of better service to the world and the people around me? And that's essentially it, you know?
mm-hmm,
Like that's what we're called to do.
mm-hmm.
So this is just kind of my easiest way to see into the public
Yeah, what's
perception.
readily available?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah. So I mean, that's, I feel like I could stop there on Ascendant.
Yeah.
Do you
I
feel
mean,
good?
yeah. And the
Okay.
only other thing I wanted to add was that, and we already talked about the first house a little bit, just because
Yeah.
we kind of had to with the rising, but
Yeah.
the first house, it's its whole own thing. And so that's why there's kind of some overlapping stuff here with the first house and the rising, because they are kind of the same thing a little bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Anything
so,
that you have in the first house, we talked about the chart ruler being significant, right? As it pushes these energies forwards and kind of shows how they manifest. Or let's say the ascendant pushes them forward and the chart ruler shows maybe more so how they manifest.
mm-hmm,
But anything in your first house, which your ascendant is your first house, but
mm-hmm,
you'll have planets, you can have planets in your first house too. Those just imagine, like when I see first house, I just think, oop, like it gets bumped up to the top of your
mm-hmm,
chart,
mm-hmm,
you know, and that's just it. It becomes more of a driving energy. The
mm-hmm.
same way we see ascendant as the driver, those planets that then fall into the first house also become drivers for
Yeah.
us. So sometimes we have multiple drivers, but the ascendant is that main one,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, um, that was
Yeah.
fun.
Feel
I
good
didn't
about
expect
that.
that to be as
Yeah.
fun as it was. But next week we'll talk about Mercury,
hmm
which I'm very excited about.
Yeah. We'll get back
Um,
to the planets.
yeah, we'll get back to the planets and we'll kind of move forward and, you know, focus on uh maybe our filter of communication. We're going from like, I think it's a fun switch because ascendant is kind of like
its own little thing.
Yeah, well, Ascendant, but it is like a, some people call it a filter, you know what I mean?
Oh
Or the
yeah, yeah,
mask or things like
yeah,
that. And then Mercury also acts as a filter for the planets,
yeah.
but in a completely different way.
Mhm.
And so it'll be fun to kind of go from one to the other. Um, but one thing that I did want to read off were Chani's 3 core guidelines,
Yes.
just to kind of like tie the episode up. And these are things that she says that she tries to keep in her mind, promises to herself, um, when, you know, practicing
Yeah.
astrology and talking about astrology. And the first one is that I promise to never give my current understanding of my chart too much power,
Mhm.
which we talked about today,
Yes.
because sometimes I live in an area of my chart and sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's really great, but
Mhm.
to not get too tied to either side of that and allow myself to just explore all
Especially
of
when
the
you find out
things.
something new,
Yeah.
a new way to interpret something, and it's like, oh, this is actually changing what I thought I
Yeah.
knew.
Once
Yeah.
it becomes like a conscious working part of what you know your chart to be, it sometimes can be harder to tap into the other things and just to remain open,
Right.
you know? And so the second thing she says is, I promise to never underestimate the wisdom that is woven into my chart.
Mhm.
And I promise to always leave room for learning, unlearning, and relearning. Huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huge, you
We're
know?
going we're going through that even just doing this, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, not that we don't have our own sort of understanding, but
Yeah.
it's now we're
Like getting like a new perspective of
yeah.
things, and like I have to allow myself especially to like unlearn and relearn.
Mhm.
It's like I thought that this is what this meant, and maybe that is what that meant, but maybe it also means something more, or maybe it
Right.
means something different.
And
um
not to get like too, I don't know, like emo, I guess, about it, but I think that for me, I actually used to really struggle with, I mean, I think maybe you talk about this too with your cancer parts, or
mm,
but I used to really struggle with certain parts of my chart and hated them. And or you know, and almost that's almost kind of like hating yourself or not liking certain parts of yourself, and they're still going to be there. And
so true.
um I think that part of the reason is because I also just don't really fully understand them or what I learned about them, especially, you know, not to be a hater, but some of the stuff you see on like just what's the word, mainstream, you know, topical astrology stuff, sometimes it can like maybe like live in your head of things I see about Aries or things I see
mm,
about Libra, and what, and then what does that mean about me, you know?
yeah,
And so I think wanting to open that door and like dive deeper and get to know those parts of yourself and give more time and space and life to that, like I think can be, you know, really good
huge.
for yourself
Yeah,
too. So
I
yeah.
agree.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, thanks for listening, guys, and we will see you next time when we talk about Mercury.